Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Luisa, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You were at the session titled Enhancing Resilience Across Borders, Using Science to Call for Regional Action in the HinduKush Himalaya. Japanese language simultaneous interpretation is available during this session. The feature has already been activated and is available now. To listen in Japanese language, please click the interpretation button in the menu at the bottom of your screen and select Japanese. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You were at the session titled Enhancing Resilience Across Borders, Using Science to Call for Regional Action in the HinduKush Himalaya. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, your participation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is highly encouraged. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for any technical assistance. We're ready to get started, and I will now pass the floor to Sivapuram, Research Manager at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Sivapuram, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for this opportunity, and thank you all for joining this session. So just to make sure that you are in the session on enhancing resilience across borders, using science to call for regional action in the HinduKush Himalaya. Now for the next 90 minutes, what we are going to do is, we will discuss about transboundary climate change risks in the HinduKush Himalaya and what they mean for their fight against climate change in the region and beyond. Now, if you look at the title of the session, you will find two keywords. One is resilience across the borders. The second one is regional action. Now, these are the keywords that reflects what is wrong with our current understanding of climate change and adaptation planning. Why am I saying so? If you look at the current climate change adaptation planning paradigm, we see that adaptation is very much local and it is very much country specific. Of course, we agree that this is very much important. Adaptation has to be local and location specific. However, that itself is not very much completes the entire puzzle of climate change adaptation. There is a certain part of the puzzle that goes beyond the borders of the climate change impacts where they are actually happening. And for that, I would give you two examples. One example is the Bangkok floods in 2011 and 2008 global food price crisis. If you look at these two events, they have some similarities and some dissimilarities. For example, Bangkok flood is a single event, happened at one location. But if you look at the impacts of the Bangkok floods, those impacts could be felt beyond Bangkok and Thailand itself. And the economies of countries like Japan, Indonesia, and Malaysia were affected. And even beyond Asia, the estimates suggest that nearly 2.5% of the global industrial production was negatively affected because of just one flood event in Bangkok. Now, coming to the 2008 global food price crisis, this happened because of seemingly unrelated events that happened across the global scale that are separated by time and spatial dimensions and collided at one place, that is in terms of the food price crisis. Because of the 2008 global food price crisis, we know that how vulnerable many countries are to the factors that we have not understood thus far. So we now know that climate change impacts in one country does not limit to the country itself, but they tend to spill over the boundaries. That's one part of the problem that we want to discuss today. Secondly, why are we talking about transboundary risks in HinduKush Himalayan region? For those who are new to the HKH region, you will understand that HKH region comprises of mountainous regions spanning from Afghanistan to Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and up to Myanmar. And these mountainous regions are source for at least 10 transboundary rivers that are the source for one of the largest reservoirs of fresh water outside the poles. That's the reason why HKH region is called Water Towers of Asia or the third pole. Now, any climate change impacts in this particular HKH region is not going to stay within the HKH region, but is going to affect all the downstream countries and beyond. We already have seen from the estimates or assessments that the HKH region is warming at accelerated pace. In some estimates, it's up to 3 times the global average. And these impacts will have a debilitating impact on the socio-economic lives of the HKH region, as well as millions of people outside the region. With this background in view, in today's session, we will be looking at what the science is telling us in terms of the climate change risks that can spill across the borders. Do we have sufficient scientific basis to understand the transbound risks? What are the gaps? And based on that understanding, what are the transbound risk pathways that we should look into while we try to plan for climate change adaptation? For example, we can look at the water, we can look at the trade of goods and services, most importantly, the food trade. And subsequently, we will also look into what does it mean for the national adaptation planning. Should we limit our adaptation planning to the countries, or should we go beyond country borders for adaptation planning? For example, can we think about a regional adaptation? And finally, based on today's discussion, we want to distill some of the key messages that we want to present to the negotiators that are going to join in COP26. So without much ado, I would welcome our keynote speaker today, who is Professor Christy Eby. She is a very well-known, very famous and well-accomplished professor working with the University of Washington, and her expertise is in the area of climate change and health risks. I request you all to quickly jump onto Google and type her name, Christy Eby, and you will find an excellent body of work she has done in the field of climate and health risks, and that's a very relevant work that we want to be referring right now because of the pandemic that we are currently going through. Professor Christy has contributed to adaptation planning for many countries across the world. If you look at her CV, she has worked almost in all the continents, and she has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed papers. She contributed to the US National Climate Assessment as well as several IPCC assessments. So this doesn't justify the immense record that she has, but for the lack of time, I welcome Professor Christy to deliver her keynote presentation. Professor Christy, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you today. And thanks to everyone who is listening in. I'm going to provide a framing for the discussions we're going to have throughout this session. We know, of course, that the climate is changing. I assume you know the climate stripes, which are a quite interesting way of displaying how global temperature has changed from pre-industrial to today. It's quite useful to look at this because it illustrates something that is a particular challenge in your region, which is the rate of warming. You can see how much warming there's occurred just in the last couple of decades. And that, as that continues, will be very significant for human health, well-being, for livelihoods, for every aspect of life in the HinduKush Himalayas. I also want to thank the authors of an IPCC special report that was recently published on the ocean and the cryosphere in a changing climate. They really focused on a range of issues that are critically important for your region, and highlight some of the results that they found. As you can read on the slide, the special report really highlighted the urgency of action. There needs to be significant action both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in countries like my own that are high emitters, but also to ensure that there is ambitious and coordinated action. And as you just heard, that's really important to look across countries, that these are transboundary risks in your region that need to be addressed. The report empowers people, communities, and governments to take these actions. It combined scientific knowledge with local and indigenous knowledge, which is incredibly important for the rich indigenous and local knowledge present in your region. The report also highlighted for the first time how important education and climate literacy are to our common future. There's lots of changes that have been observed in all of the high mountain areas. This talks specifically about how there's been widespread shrinking of ice sheets, glaciers, reductions in snow cover, and increases in the permafrost temperature. The figure shows the kinds of changes that have been observed in glacier mass and the projections out to the end of the century under two assumptions of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that that mass will have significant consequences throughout the Hindu-Kush Himalayas and downstream as those glaciers melt. Accompanying that has been widespread changes in our ecosystems. So the freshwater systems, the terrestrial systems, particularly in the high mountain regions, have seen changes in the geographic range of species. It's a picture of a pika. A real change in the distribution of plants as they are moving along with these species, not because of the species, but they are moving as well because they need to be in their ideal environment. And those shifts have resulted in disturbances in ecosystems and changes in ecosystem functioning. All of that then, of course, has consequences for people. And you can see in the first bullet, there's been negative impacts on food security, water resources, water quality, livelihoods, health and well-being, infrastructure, transportation, tourism, recreation, and culture, particularly for the indigenous peoples. And that is affecting all aspects of people's lives. There's been declines in agricultural yields in some high mountain regions, particularly the Hindu-Kush, and there's been economic losses in these regions because of flood and mass movements. I'm sure you're all aware of glacier lake outburst floods. And there's a lot that can be done in terms of adaptation, particularly by including indigenous knowledge and local knowledge into adaptation to make it more effective, more efficient, and ensure faster intake by communities. From what I've said, you can understand that these changes are not the same everywhere. This is part of a long table that's in the special report. In the left-hand column, where the colors are, you can see for the Himalaya, Kush, and other high mountain areas in Asia. And as you look down the physical changes, the ecosystem changes, and then the changes for human systems and ecosystem services, that there's some things like tourism where there's been a negative impact. There has been an increase in avalanche, landslides, and floods. But in terms of issues like water availability, in terms of our forests, you can see that where you are matters, that some places are seeing declines and some are seeing increases. And that complexity needs to be taken into account as adaptation options are implemented. This shows you, particularly for the Hindu-Kush Himalayas, changes in mean water, the winter snow water equivalent in the left-hand column. And you can see that as you increase in height up the Himalayas, that there has been a smaller decline, and there's projected to be not as big a decline as at the lower altitudes. The second column shows you winter temperature, showing that there are changes in winter temperature projected at all altitudes. They don't vary as much as the winter snow water equivalent. The far right-hand column shows you summer temperatures and shows a very large increase in summer temperatures. And you can think about what that means for some of the physical changes, such as melting of the glaciers, that those changes are up to 10 degrees C in some locations. So significant impacts have occurred, and even more significant are projected. And when we think about climate change, we have to think about other factors that are changing as well. It's not just climate that's driving the impacts. It's the interaction of the hazards created by a change in climate, the various ecosystems, cities, communities that are exposed to those hazards, and their underlying vulnerability and resilience. The extent to which they're prepared makes a really big difference. So when we think about our future risk, we need to think about all three aspects to better understand what we can do immediately to make a real difference in the short and the longer term, and what are some of our medium and longer term needs. The projections show lots of changes, further changes in mountain cryosphere, and you can see the hazards are changing. And think about flooding, for example, and how flooding does cross country borders. And so you do need to think about how these work in the transboundary sense, not just within an individual country. Changing water availability will be a significant challenge in many parts of the region, and there will need to be increased attention to issues like water and sanitation. The last bullet reinforces an integrated water management and transboundary cooperation is critically needed to be able to be prepared for the changes that are projected. There are a range of actions that can be undertaken to enable climate resilience and sustainable development. The first bullet talks about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The second talks about enabling conditions, that if we build these now, we can help increase resilience to a changing climate. The cooperation and coordination I just mentioned, the climate literacy, monitoring and forecasting, using all the available knowledge sources, addressing social vulnerability, and ensuring, of course, that there is financial and institutional support for the work that needs to be done. When we think about climate change, I found this a very useful figure from the World Health Organization. If you consider now a normal period of time, we could argue about that. But as climate continues to change, it's going to cause both shocks and stresses. And those shocks and stresses on systems then can cause a real drop in the performance of those systems. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's lots of ways that we can recover or not recover. And that it is up to us, the kinds of actions, the kinds of science we undertake, the coordination with governments, the science to policy handshake, to ensure that governments have the information to make the choices so that in fact we can transform after there is a performance drop. The second best is recover better than before. And so we really want to make sure we incorporate the environmental information that we have, the understanding of exposure and vulnerability, to build stronger systems so that we can have a much better future, even as the climate continues to change. In health, the goal is also for climate resilience and environmental sustainability. The left circle shows you the building blocks of health systems in the middle. Around that are 10 particular areas of focus to ensure climate resilience. There's work going on in all of these areas in many countries in your region. The second figure shows you, particularly for healthcare facilities, what needs to be done. Lots that needs to be done. As you can see in the left-hand figure, one of the actions are vulnerability, capacity, and adaptation assessments. And many countries in your region have undertaken those to help identify the kinds of high priority health adaptation measures that are needed. This is an overall summary of these kinds of measures. There is work that is starting for many of these issues in your region. The real challenge for implementing more has been the lack of financial resources. That when you look at the adaptation funds under the UNFCCC, only about 2% has gone to health. And finally, the report concludes that it is imperative that we act decisively, act earlier to be able to address unavoidable changes, manage these risks, and improve our lives and achieve sustainability. We're only going to be able to do this if we coordinate and cooperate across sectors, across scientific disciplines, and across countries to address the transboundary risks. With that, thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention and look forward to the questions, and I really look forward to the rest of the panel as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Christie, for your wonderful presentation and also for very clearly laying out the available scientific evidence that have transboundary climate change implications. And also thank you very much for concluding your session with a high note on the health implications of climate change. because that's very relevant for us currently because of the ongoing pandemic situation that we are facing. We will come back to you for more detailed interaction with the audience. Before we go on to the panel discussion, I request my colleagues to run the Slido session. We want to understand our participants, from where they are, how much do they understand the transboundary risk. So what you can do is, Mr. Udayan has already, shown the slide on the screen. You can either use a QR scanner if your mobile has one, or you can log into your web browser and type slido.com. And once the page loads, you will see a field where you can enter #20541. So I encourage all the participants to participate in the interactive session. We will keep the slide for a few seconds so that you all can either scan the QR code or enter the address in the web browser. We suggest you use the mobile phone so that you can simultaneously view the results as well as you can respond to the survey. Okay. Now, can we start the Slido session, Udayanji? So in the first question, we are asking from which organization you represent. So you can select one option there. I can see that intergovernmental organizations, university are representing in a large number. Especially, it's very good that university and research organizations are largely represented, 36%, because that's where we want to see the scientific evidence for transboundary risks so that we can inform the policymakers on how we can address them in the adaptation planning. So university and research organizations are the single largest block of participants today, followed by intergovernmental organizations, developmental practitioners, students. We will keep the survey for some more time until we reach a critical threshold value, a minimum of 20 participants. That would be approximately 50% of our total participants. Okay, so probably I think that's the threshold we are hitting now. So if you can scroll up, Udayanji. So we have 41% from university or research organizations, followed by governments, which is very good, and intergovernmental organizations. So the next question, please. So the next question is, we want to know whether your country or your area of work is affected by transboundary climate risk. Sorry for combining two questions into the same because of the limited time. We had to do that. So a large number are saying your work or your country is affected by transboundary climate risk. That's very good to understand the importance of the transboundary risk for your own work and for your own countries. Okay, thank you very much, Udayanji. And with this introductory Slido session, we hope we understood the participants' profile here, largely universities followed by governments. And many of you said your work or your countries are affected by transboundary climate risk. And with that understanding, now we go into the panel discussion. Now, in the panel, we have esteemed panel members representing different backgrounds. We have Dr. Arun Bhaktashrestha. He is a regional climate change specialist as well as program manager, managing a program at ICIMOD called Regional River Basins and Cryosphere Program. He is a well-known expert in the field of hydrology and meteorology. He worked with, his interests are glaciers, glacier hazards, glacier lake outbursts, and he worked also extensively in the hydrological modeling. It's very good to know that Dr. Shrestha is extensively represented in various prestigious journal review panels or editor panels. For example, Frontiers in Earth Sciences and various Elsevier journals. And he also lead authored the HIMAP report of ICIMOD, that is one of the flagship publications outlining the environmental and climate change impacts in the HKH region. With this brief introduction, I welcome, of course, the next presenter would be Ms. Frida Lager. She is extensively working on transboundary climate risks and climate change adaptation. She has done extensive work in areas of risk transmission via international trade, investments, infrastructure, and shared and connected ecosystem services as well. She is currently focusing on what she is calling just adaptation or just resilience. So her intervention will help us understand why we need to make our adaptation interventions more just. Which is a very important part of our, addressing transboundary climate risks. Followed by Ms. Frida, we have Mr. Mazharul Alam. He is famously known as Babu. For those of you who is from Asia Pacific region, you know him very well. He worked extensively in the field of climate change adaptation for the past several decades. And now currently he's working as regional coordinator at the United Nations Environmental Program. Before joining UNEP, he worked with the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. Before that, he worked with the government of Bangladesh, where he led the National Adaptation Program of Action. So he understands the challenges involved in adaptation planning. And he is also known for coordinating the important task of G77 representation in the COP during 2007 to 2009. And currently, he is busy guiding countries in implementing Paris Agreement. So Dr. Babu will be talking about to what extent our adaptation plans recognize the national transboundary climate change risk and what we need to do to bridge the gap. Those are the three panel members we have for today, and followed by that, we will have question and answers from the audience. So without much ado, I welcome Dr. Arun Bhaktashrestha to speak about transboundary implications of the hydrological disasters in the HKH region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Let me know if you have my screen visible.
Yes, you are visible. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and your introduction in the beginning, and also the keynote has very nicely set the scene and provided a lot of background important for my talk. So what I can now do is just to get directly into my talk and talk a little bit more about the details, what I'm going to talk is about transboundary risks from changing climate and changing cryosphere in the HinduKush Himalaya region. To start with, I would like to talk about the climate context, which has been a little bit, elaborated in the keynote. But what I would like to say is that, of course, the region is facing rapid climate change, which is comparable. What has happened in the past is comparable or even higher than the global average warming. The precipitation extremes increasing and becoming more erratic, spatially and temporally. And that's in the past, but looking at the future, both warming and precipitation extremes are likely to increase into the future. So depending on how we go with our climate, scenarios with the, emissions, It could range from 2.2 to 3.3 for RCP 4.5, and then 4.2 to 6.5 for RCP 8.5, right? So these are, quite big numbers. And then rainfall to increase up to 25% by the end of the century. And what is also important is the elevation dependent warming is quite there. So it will continue into the future. That means the higher altitude will warm more. So what it means is that, even if the world manages by any means to stabilize at 1.5 degree by the end of the century, the HinduKush Himalaya will warm much more. So even 1.5 degree will be too hot for HinduKush Himalaya region. 1.5 degree warming will still mean that we'll lose 1/3 of the glacier volume. And if we go by current emission trend, 2/3 of glacier volume will be lost. So all those numbers actually tells us that HinduKush Himalaya is a real, climate hotspot. And then, these actually turn into different kinds of hazards. Not going into a lot of details, I just put two, pictures here. The left one is a scene of hydropower dam, which was wrecked by a small glacier lake outburst flood, which we call GLOF, which happened in 2016. But what is important is that small lake was in Tibet. And this hydropower was in Nepal, right? And it completely devastated that hydropower dam. So that's one example in the interface between China and Nepal. Then second is example in the transboundary context of Nepal and India. And this is a different type of flood. It was an embankment breach, the Koshi embankment breach, which happened in 2008. And the breach happened in Nepal. But then in terms of impact, India really suffered, and the numbers tells you the affected people were somewhere around 53,000 in Nepal, and then 3 million in India. So these are just representative examples showing, what kind of transboundary hazards are there, and many of those hazards go beyond borders. But then there are many other hazards. In the right, figure, you can see that the region is, impacted by many different kinds of hazard. It's a multi-hazard environment: storm, flood, landslide, earthquake, drought, extreme floods. And then, it is not only about the events, it's also about people killed and impacted, and also about the economic loss. But then it seems like flood is one very important kind of hazard in this region. Then the right, bar shows that, in the past, many of those hazards have, increasing trends. If not all, many of them are increasing, and climate could be one factor behind it. Now, moving from hazard to risk, just again, the left slide actually, which is quite complicated, are showing many positions of past glacial lake outburst floods, or existing lakes, and then downstreams are the hydropower projects existing or planned or under construction. And you can clearly see almost all of those hydropower dams, hydropower projects are under risk, right? So that's one, just an illustrative example to show the risk. Then on the right side, what I show is two time snaps of a river stretch. This is in Botekoshi in Nepal. And I have identified some areas in red circle where in 2000 you barely see any houses. Those small dots are houses, right? Then if you look at 2020, you can see many areas which have been, built up. And many of those areas are very close to the river stream. And this is the very stretch where this 2016 flood had happened, right? So the risk is increasing. And then, we know the vulnerability aspects. I have, these are houses, I cannot show the people, but then, most of the people who are living here are quite vulnerable. They do not have access to many support systems. Poverty is very prevalent there. So that's very important. So increasing risk is a very important factor. Now, I have been talking about flood quite a lot, but it's not the only kind of hazard and risk we are facing in the HinduKush Himalaya region. The slow onset kind of thing is also happening. And here I'm talking about water availability and its impact, particularly in agriculture. The top panel actually shows how much the glacier melts. When glacier melt actually contributes to the downstream. Blue is high, red is low. So this shows that the western river basins like Indus is very much dependent on meltwater. And then, it also shows in the lower panel how much agriculture is dependent. Different crop, are dependent on meltwater. Again, in the western part of this region, in this Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra river basin set, the Indus seems to be quite sensitive to the climate change and its impact on, agriculture. But then above this, we also see that uncertainty and variability in the hydrological regimes are increasing, and it's going to increase in the future. So apart from that impact in agriculture in Indus, the other region will also see impacts related to uncertainty in water availability. So with that, I come to my final, slide, which is, how do we then, talk about resilience to transboundary flood? And I think this 6 actions, urgent action, as proposed by the call to actions by, this call to action is very important. And there are 6 call to actions, but those boxed here are important. To start with, regional data and information sharing is very important because, as in the case of Botekoshi, Nepal did not know that even a gulf was happening. So sharing of that information is very important. And for that, regional cooperation for transboundary risk management is very important. And we have a few initiatives going on, like the Upper Indus Basin Network and Koshi DRR Knowledge Hub, which actually tries to contribute to this regard. The second one is the climate action. I think that's very important to take urgently take climate actions. And 1.5 degree, which might seem to be very ambitious, but it is really, really necessary that we achieve that target. Because without that, I think the climate change is definitely going to be turning into climate crisis and will definitely lead to the runaway climate change kind of scenario. And the third is invest in adaptation. Resilience building is, of course, very important. Without that, I think that is not possible. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arun, for laying out the climate context of HKH region, for stressing that the HKH region is a climate and hazard hotspot with significant transboundary implications. You have very well impressed upon the fact that there is a need for cooperation in the region to manage hazards like Gulf and transboundary rivers floods. So we appreciate your efforts. We'll come back to you during the question and answer interactive session. So this presentation leads logically to our next speaker, who will be speaking about the trade and related implications of climate change and how we can ensure just adaptation, or what she calls just resilience in our efforts to mitigate the transboundary climate risk. So I welcome Ms. Frida.
Thank you very much, Prabhakar. I'm very honored to be here. Pretty early morning in Europe. I'm going to see if I'll manage to share my content here. Let's see. Sorry, apologies. It's working well this morning.
In case if there is a trouble, maybe our colleagues can operate your slides.
Yes, I think it's working now, yes?
Great, yes, wonderful.
So thank you very much for letting me join this session. I'm going to talk, as Prabhakar just said, just briefly on transboundary climate risk, specifically trade, and what we can do to ensure a just transition for adaptation. Yes. As we just heard some excellent examples on, in a globalizing world, climate risk connect communities many thousands of kilometers apart. We've conceptually divided the pathways in which climate risk can flow in 4 pathways: financial flows, biophysical flows, such as the shared water resources and ecosystem, as Dr. Arun has just given some examples of in the HinduKush Himalaya region. People's pathways, flow of immigrants, tourism and workers. And lastly, the focus for this presentation today that I'm doing is the transmission of transboundary climate risk via trade. So the cascading effects of climate change across systems and societies has so far been overlooked largely in climate adaptation. That's also why we're focusing so much on it today in this session. But if systemic cross-border effects are not considered in adaptation, action designed to reduce climate risks and vulnerability could reinforce or redistribute climate risk and vulnerability instead of enhancing it and deepening existing inequality and threatening human security. And I'm going to show some examples of how this can look like in the real world, so to speak. And to do that, I'm going to start somewhere entirely other than the Asia-Pacific region, starting in Senegal in West Africa, but with the very familiar example of rice. Rice has been the most important staple food in Senegal over the last 40 years or so. And most rice consumed there is imported from countries in Asia. A significant portion of the rice consumed in Senegal is more specifically produced in low-lying coastal, climate-vulnerable regions in Southeast Asia. I suspect many of you might already be aware of some of the intricacies in the global rice market. Comparatively small amounts of rice is traded internationally, so prices can fluctuate significantly when countries suddenly enter or leave international markets. This is the case in 2007-8. So we already heard a little bit about the global food crisis, where specifically for rice in Senegal, India halted its exports of rice. This led to panic buying by major rice exporters such as the Philippines, and further rice export restrictions by other major exporters such as Vietnam, just in order to stabilize their own domestic rice prices. This led to prices skyrocketing in Senegal by 200% in local markets, also causing social instability and protests. And despite facing a potentially significant transboundary climate risk, there's very little that Senegal, a country that ultimately depends on the success of adaptation, taken thousands of miles away in Asia, can currently do about it. Reducing Senegal's dependency on rice import could increase resilience in Senegal. You could say it was a strong adaptation strategy, but it would also maybe increase levels of vulnerability in Southeast Asia, where rice production is a key source of incomes for many poor communities and a key source of work, income and social capital for women in particular. Just briefly on most recent developments, because it's interesting to this example. Last year we saw China for the first time in more than 3 decades importing rice from India, following droughts in Thailand and food price rises in China caused by floodings in the Yangtze River. All of this exacerbated by supply chain disruptions in general due to the COVID-19 crisis. And so besides from affecting China, India, Vietnam, and many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, we see this climate risk cascading and transmitting all the way here, for example, to West Africa. Now, this is a very telling example of a very real and active climate-induced transboundary risk transmitted via trade. And so we can get a glimpse of what might be to come in the future. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about this framework that Prabhakar has hinted that I'm working with. We bring the case of Senegal to this Asian Pacific Adaptation Forum for a reason. This session is focused on inclusive resilience for all. It can be argued in true laissez-faire fashion that all countries should fend for themselves on the global markets. But countries around the globe are differently impacted by climate change and have different abilities to respond and adapt. Most nations depend on trade to secure their food demand. As we sit down and plan climate adaptation actions in an interconnected world, shouldn't we be interested in how we truly build global resilience? For this purpose, we've developed a novel framework that interprets what a just transition would mean for adaptation in an interconnected world. The framework describes and illustrates the importance of actively engaging and grappling the connectedness of our global system. And at the same time as we're starting for a just adaptation, both when it comes to procedure and distribution of the benefits of the adaptation efforts. The framework shows that only planning adaptation on a local or national level, as we do currently all too often, we risk building only pockets or fragments of resilience or just redistributing this globally. So for the past few minutes, I've shown you one example on how climate impact can be transmitted via trade, how adaptation can both redistribute risk or even increase vulnerability elsewhere, and that adaptation in an interconnected world therefore should be sought for in cooperation. Building global resilience requires that we focus on justice explicitly and embrace the global connectedness and pave the road ahead with a just transition for adaptation. And that's all from me for now, and I look forward a lot to talking to you more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Frida, for a wonderful presentation and for stressing the importance of understanding trade pathways and how vulnerable they are to climate change, and also how they can redistribute climate change risks and enhance climate change vulnerabilities. I'm sure you will get a lot of questions from our attendants, so we look forward to the interaction later in the day. So without much ado, I welcome Mr. Babu to talk about the current state of adaptation planning and how best we can address the gaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair Prabhakar, old friend of mine, for chairing this session. And also I'd like to express my thanks to Chris and Arun and Frida for framing the session and the discussion. Now, I'm going to talk about the National Adaptation Plan process and how it provides the opportunity to incorporate the climate risk, which are beyond boundaries. And you have heard a lot about the transboundary, the word. And I'm going to talk more about the whole issue of inclusiveness within the assessment and how the NAP can provide a good entry point. Now, when we talk about the boundary and the inclusiveness in the context of assessment and using the science, I'd like to just unpack that into two. One is I'd like to talk about the national boundary, which is not the physical boundary, which is primarily I'm going to refer about the sectors, the stakeholders that we normally bring to a table when we carry out the assessment. And this is what we need to think about, going beyond the usual group of the stakeholders or the actors that we normally bring to a table when we do the assessment. The second aspect that I also would like to talk about within that the national, the boundaries and the scope is not only talking about this, only think about the biophysical impacts of climate change, but also how the development is going to make progress and how the development themselves is going to be impacted by climate change. The reason behind the socioeconomic development and the economic strength of the country is important because that defines the adaptive capacity of a country or the adaptive capacity of the society and how they are going to address that. So in addition to bringing the biophysical aspect of the changes and the impact, it is also important to include the direct and the indirect sectors who is going to be impacted too. So that is the way I'm actually talking about this, the inclusiveness in the adaptation exercise and assessment exercise. And if we are failing to bring this, the biophysical aspect and the socioeconomic aspect and the development pathway in the assessment, then we'll be missing a significant part of the adaptive capacity, which is the important elements defining the vulnerability of a country, defining the vulnerability of the people, defining the vulnerability of the sector. So we need to bring this assessment in the context of the inclusiveness and making it a dynamic. Why we need to make this assessment dynamic? The climate is not static. The climate change is in a dynamic. The development is not static, it is dynamic. So unless we make this assessment, in one hand, A is an inclusive and B is in a dynamic, then we'll be making a huge gap understanding the problem, understanding the gaps and defining what are the adaptation interventions are necessary to build the resilience. Now what is happening in the context of the usual, the environment, when we see that the assessment is happening, is the usual tendency is to bring the stakeholder and actors who we call usually the usual suspect. Now, when the climate change is going to bring surprise, we need to also expand that scope and going beyond the usual suspect. And who we need to bring in the whole exercise of the national adaptation planning beyond the usual suspect is the other ministries or the sectors who will be impacted indirectly by climate change. It can be related to the trade, it can be related to the export-oriented sectors. So that is where I see the necessity to expand this boundary or the scope within the country and make it more inclusive when the assessment is happening and making it dynamic. Now, if we go beyond the boundaries of the national boundaries, when we're talking about assessment, it is primarily, we see some countries where they share the common resources or they have the common watershed. Usually, depending on the capacity of the country in the region, some country, if they have the capacity, they incorporate some of the biophysical aspect in terms of the changes is likely to happen beyond their geographical or the political boundary and incorporate into their assessment. But it is not happening in all countries, even within the same watershed or the geographical region. For example, in the Mekong, the river basin, or the Ganges Brahmaputra river basin. Some countries answer is yes, some countries answer is no. But it is not going even beyond that biophysical aspect, and incorporating the changes is likely to happen in the other sector outside your country. So that is another area that it requires to bring in the assessment and make it inclusive. And why it is important? It is important because if we look into the current economy, the current growth model, they are interconnected. There are trade, there are export, the tourism. So everything are interconnected. So it is important to understand that what is happening outside the national boundary and how to incorporate that to understand your future, the risk, which likely to arise due to the changes outside of your national boundary. So that is an important aspect to also bring in. Now, it is not only the biophysical, but it is also important the other sector and how the other sector is going to accommodate or address the climate vulnerabilities outside your boundary. For example, if an upstream country is putting water resource management as a measure to address the climate change and making that as a part of the adaptation intervention, it will have and a bearing on the downstream countries. So even it is not only the climate change, how the climate change is going to impact the downstream, but adaptation intervention in upstream country may have a bearing on the downstream country too. So we need to make it inclusive, not only the biophysical, but also to understand what kind of the adaptation interventions that in a common watershed other countries are going to do, and that will have a bearing on your vulnerabilities and the risk. So one country's adaptation may become the vulnerability and risk to another country. So unless we make those kind of the inclusive assessment, we'll be making a significant part of understanding the current risk and understanding the future risk. So that is the reason. Now, if we look into the number of countries who are doing the NAP, and in my view, that provides an opportunity. It's not only the NAP, but it is also the other the policy documents, the regional collaboration, the nationally determined contribution that they are also putting together. Now, UNFCCC recently published a document about how many countries are doing their the NAP, how many countries submitted their proposal to the Green Climate Fund for the financial support. And that number is around 80, 85, or maybe even 90 today, because that report came the last year in November. But if we look into those number of countries, is half of the countries is actually currently undertaking their risk assessment. Half of the country will be embarking on that kind of the risk assessment, which will be the critical building block for their national adaptation plan. So within that context, this is a very important, and that provides the opportunity to bring this aspect into understanding the risk and designing their adaptation plan, which will be more inclusive to address the climate change, not only arising the problem within the national boundary, but also outside the national boundary. I'd like to just end by presenting two ideas which may support, because it is easy to say, but it is not that easy to materialize the idea. So the two things that I'd like to just mention in my presentation. One is, as this is a regional issue and requires the collaboration between or among countries, the role of the regional organization like the ICIMOD, organization like the Mekong River Commission, who can play an important role in terms of bringing the information together and helping the countries to understand this, the interlinkages and the problem, and helping them to incorporate these transboundary issues into their national adaptation planning exercise. And they have the capacity, the regional organization, they're doing things at the regional level, but personally, I believe this is a time to expand their support to the country level, and the organizations who are supporting countries to prepare their national adaptation plan, including understanding their climate risk and the vulnerabilities. The second idea that I'd like to present and end my talk is, if we look into the where the funding is happening to support the countries to prepare their adaptation plan, it's a similar the idea what we have heard as a part of the keynote address this morning, is set up the principles which will bring this the transboundary aspect as a part of the systemic approach, and helping countries to incorporate the transboundary issues, expanding the stakeholder, including the uncertainties which is unknown right now, but may arise due to the climate change, to set up a principles to incorporate these transboundary issues when we are supporting countries through the different funding mechanisms. Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure sharing my views and ideas in the discussion.
Thank you
Over
very
to you,
much.
Prabhakar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Babu, for laying out a rich list of measures that we need to take to make the adaptation an inclusive one. You talked about inclusive assessments, and you suggested us that we should go beyond the usual stakeholders that we stick to in our adaptation assessments. And you also suggested that we should look into the climate change implications on the development, because you thought the economic capacity is the single most important capacity for any country to adapt. And you suggested that we need to look into the role played by the regional organizations such as ICIMOD or MRC, and you called for funding that is more inclusive, more flexible, so that the transboundary impacts of climate change can be addressed at the regional level. So thank you so much for these important points. Now with this, we conclude the brief panel discussion or panel presentation session. Before we go to the next session, we will have a brief round of Slido again, to receive some of the inputs from you. But going by the interaction that I'm seeing in the chat box, we need a lot of questions from you because we want this session to be very interactive. So please think hard and fast what kind of questions you want to ask before you leave this session. We don't want you to leave the session dissatisfied or incomplete. So please think about the questions and please pose the questions so that our panel members can answer them appropriately. So with that, I request my colleague Udayan to run the Slido now. Udayan?
Yes, doing it shortly.
Yeah. So again, for those who joined late in the session, what you have to do is either you scan the QR code on the screen or enter the address slido.com in your web browser and enter #20541. That's the code that you need to enter into the session. So we will post this screen for a few seconds so that all of you can either screen or scan or enter the address properly. Okay, Udayanji, can you see how many could enter into the session?
Okay. I'll be able to see that only after I run the question.
Yeah, yeah. Now probably we can enter into the Slido now.
Do you see the question?
Yeah. So the first question is, what do you think are the major transboundary climate risks in Asia? Now it talks about disasters, water insecurity, energy insecurity, trade, and migration. So please choose any top 3 options in the sequence that you feel is okay, can you scroll up, please? So we see that water insecurity is the #1 important transboundary risk, followed by disasters and migration. It's very interesting that the trade and energy are down at the bottom. We will wait until we receive at least a minimum of 20 responses. Right now we have 15. That's very good. Still, water insecurity, disasters, migration are in the top 3. Great, I think we can close the question now. So we have disasters as the most important transboundary risk, followed by, of course, it changed again, water insecurity and migration. It's among these 3 top options. Okay, Udayanji, we can move to the next question, please. So given those top 3 transboundary risk, what we should do? What are the appropriate solutions? So we want you to identify top 2 options. One is either you think that countries can deal with the transbound risks in a bilateral manner, or you expect regional bodies such as ASEAN, SAARC to play a major role, or we want new mechanisms under UNFCCC. Okay, as Dr. Babu said, regional bodies plays an important role in addressing transbound risks, followed by we want to go to UNFCCC for a collective action. Very interestingly, we don't want two countries to work together, or maybe that's the least option. Okay, thank you very much. So we can go to the next question if we have. So now, you all have heard the keynote presentation and panel discussions. Now, before we invite Drupaji, what do you expect Drupaji to say? So these are some of the options that we want to, or messages that we want to carry to the COP26. One is we want to improve the scientific understanding. I know there are several mechanisms under COP26 to help countries to strengthen their scientific assessments. So do we want those current mechanisms to strengthen for the understanding of transbound risk? The second one is we want to recognize HKH as an important hotspot. Very good. So you say that we need to recognize the TBRs first, followed by understanding the TBRs for the rapidly changing ranking. So I'll keep watching. You can probably you can retain without scrolling up and down. Okay, so we are almost there. So the number one important message that we want to carry forward to COP26 is we want to improve our scientific understanding. That is very much relevant and is also the important message from this particular session. Followed by provide adequate climate financing. That's very interesting, which Dr. Babu talked about as well. And thirdly, we want to recognize HKH as a hotspot. So very well done, and thank you very much for this rich interactive session. Now I move to the question and answers. Do we have any question and answer questions in the chat box? Okay, so I have noted down a couple of questions that I noticed. The first question is, how can we finance transboundary collaboration to set climate change risks and vulnerabilities? And then who should assess agreements, validate and approve, knowing such global impacts are likely? So probably I would welcome, because this is talking about finance, may I welcome Dr. Babu to respond to this particular question. I will read the question again. How can we finance transboundary collaboration to set climate change risks and vulnerabilities? And then who should assess agreements, validate and approve, knowing such global impacts are likely?
Thank you, Prabhakar. As I mentioned, in terms of the transboundary, the climate risk, and incorporating that into the national adaptation plan, is to think about setting some principles when the different funding agencies are providing support to the countries. So that, in my view, can be considered as a first step, which will then bring the different actors together to collaborate and cooperate. I do not fully understand the last part of the question, who will be signing the agreement. If it is related to multi-country support by one particular donor, then it may be the lead organization who will be providing support can sign that one. And if it is the regional organization who has the existing governance structure to deal with, and they can be the supreme body to take the decision.
Thank you very much, Babu, for wonderful response. The second question is there any way we can value women, local and indigenous communities in making climate resilient systems protected, promoted, adopted and recognized by the system? I understand the person he is talking about, how do we make sure the role of the women and the local and indigenous communities within the context of the transboundary climate risk. So probably I welcome Dr. Arun and to some extent Dr. Frida could also respond to this question, and also any other panel member who is ready can also respond. So I'll read the question again. Is there any way we can value women, local and indigenous communities in making climate resilient systems protected, promoted and adopted and recognized by the system? I think that's, we need to little bit adapt it to the transboundary context here.
Yeah, I think that's the key, because all those things are very much important, right? You know, at national or local context, but now we are putting one more layer on top of it, which is transboundary context, right? And we are talking about, you know, if we lump all those keywords together, it's about inclusiveness at transboundary level. I think there is a question also in the question box. I think here, on top of, you know, valuing, you know, the gender, the women's knowledge on responding to the risk, the local knowledge, etc. I think at a transboundary context, it's also very important when we talk about inclusiveness is that, you know, the different administrative entities involved are aware and informed and actually have access to respond to the risk. I think that is what I would say is the inclusiveness in the transboundary context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arun. Do we have any other responses from our panel members? Yes, Frida, please.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's obviously very important. And second, Dr. Arun, on this, that we risk to, because we look at, when we look at transboundary climate risk, we focus on even more complex parts of the problem. So it's really easily happens that you forget about the parts in a way. And this is also why we really think that we need to really emphasize the need to focus on the specifically vulnerable. We already know that already vulnerable communities and people are even more exposed to climate risk, and this is also true, of course, in the case of transboundary climate risk. I would emphasize also the need to focus on including most vulnerable in both the process of adaptation planning and the outcomes of the adaptation actions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Do you have any hands from the panel members to respond to this question? Yes, Professor Christie. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question, and I very much appreciate the comments from the other panelists. And I wanted to add something particularly from the special report I spoke about, which is the importance of climate literacy and education, and to think about opportunities to educate the most vulnerable, not just about climate change in particular, but also about the transboundary risks, so that they've got greater awareness of what happens across countries, and that they can look at ways in which they're adapting to a changing climate, finding mechanisms to capture the best practices, the lessons learned, and see how those could then be scaled up across countries. And so taking advantage of what people have already done to try and increase everybody's resilience. Thank you.
Fantastic, Professor. We have the next question on asking us to relate the transboundary risks with the inclusive resilience. How are they related? Are there any panel members who is willing to answer this question? How are the transboundary risk and inclusive resilience are related? I understand Dr. Babu talked about this to some extent in his intervention, and also probably Ms. Frida could also contribute to the discussion. Dr. Babu, would you like to?
As I have already talked, I think it would be good if may I request Frida to start?
Yes, yeah, that's fine, yes.
Let's see. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, can you repeat that question, Prabhakar?
Yeah, can you relate the transbound risk with the inclusive resilience? How are they related?
Okay, yeah.
I think we are experiencing some audio problem. We could not hear you. Ms. Frida, probably you are on mute.
Okay, Prabhakar, I'll be happy to start. I thought it would be good that if Frida start, while she's sorting out the technology and little glitches. So as I mentioned, that if we look into the inclusiveness, and normally if we look into the social science and the literature, we normally talked about the inclusiveness in terms of the gender, inclusiveness in terms of the marginal people. But when I was talking about the inclusiveness in the context of assessing vulnerability, understanding the risk, I was presenting this inclusiveness within the two contexts and making it in one. Inclusiveness is bringing the sectors, normally we don't include them in understanding their vulnerability. And the second one is inclusiveness, bringing the external factors which will change the narrative, change the risk profile of a country and making it dynamic. And by doing that, we'll able to make the resilience also the inclusive. So those are the two, the additional context and the perspective that I was presenting in my talk. And that is the way I see the connection between this, the inclusiveness within the science and the assessment and supporting the resilience building effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babu, for a very apt reply. Should I wait for Frida, or probably we will move on to the next question? Frida can come in at any time. The next question is, why is glacial policy not a specific area of transboundary risks? There are lots of methods and past exemplars to guide an approach to transboundary waterways, but I haven't seen coordinated approaches to glacial policy, which could include such things as monitoring snowpack, ice pack, albedo values, gloves, etc. I think this is the question that can be very well responded by Dr. Arun. Can I read out the question again? Why is glacial policy not a specific area of transbound risk? There is an assumption there. There are lots of methods and past exemplars to guide an approach to transboundary waterways, but I haven't seen coordinated approaches to glacial policy.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question completely, but what I take is, not going very specifically to glacier related, but overall water related, regional, policies, or for that matter, regional, pathway or plan, I think are by and large missing. And for that, I think we need to see the context in the HinduKush Himalaya, the countries sharing the HinduKush Himalaya. Water is still a very sensitive issue. and therefore, water information sharing, what happens in the upstream and downstream in any aspect of water, whether it is about the quantum, whether it is about the the quality, the timing, or even it is about the extremes like floods. I think it is very inadequate or even missing in our context. I think that needs to be reminded here. We all know about that, but the changing context, the climate context actually has time and again reminded us that without transboundary cooperation and a mechanism that actually helps in this regard, I think we are not going to respond to the challenges. I think that is the reality, and sooner the countries in this region actually come to those frameworks that actually guides us in coming up with a strategy plan to manage those water related challenges in transboundary context, I think it is not going to help us. And of course, the waterways, agreements have been discussed, but that is also still none of the countries have actually endorsed this. So I think this is the context. But I think the reality is, sooner we think about it and act on it, the better it is for us for resilience building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arun. I really want to continue this Q&A session, but probably because we don't have much time, this would be the last question. What I see is, have you witnessed significant barriers to regional cooperation on climate change due to political frictions? I think this is a very, probably most of us, we understand. Any panel members are willing to answer? Have we witnessed any significant barriers to regional cooperation due to political frictions? Okay, so probably we should move on because of the lack of time. Now, I take this opportunity to welcome our next speaker. He is Dr. Drupad Chowdhury. He is the Chief Scaling Operations working at ICIMOD. Dr. Drupad Chowdhury ji, he has an excellent long 2 decades of experience as expert working on marginalized mountain communities as a researcher, as well as later as a developmental practitioner. He is known for his work on natural resource management, policy, and market-driven transformations. As a chief of the scaling operations, he is carrying out a very difficult task of coordinating and collaborating among different stakeholders, including governments, private sector entities, as well as with the intention of scaling up ICIMOD's interventions across the region. One of the major achievements of his career includes being a member of a technical support group that drafted Scheduled Tribes and Other Forest Dwellers Bill in India that was later on enacted as an Act of Parliament in 2007. So with this brief introduction, I welcome Dr. Drupad Chowdhury to help us. What are the important points that we should take to the COP26? Dr. Drupad Chowdhury, you have 7 minutes approximately.
Thank you very much, Prabhakar. Let me share my screen and then start off. Okay. Do you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, all right. So just before I start on the recommendations, I think it's good. You, as chair, you had introduced in your opening remarks the importance of HKH. I just want to dwell a second on this. You see 2 maps on my slide. One shows the 10 rivers which arise from the Himalayas, and the shaded area tells you the downstream areas or the river basins which are supported by these rivers from the Himalayas. In the next map, which is below that, you see the food bowls or areas where agriculture is very important, and these are the food bowls of Asia. and therefore very important in terms of ensuring food security. Now, the HKH basin supports some of the world's most populated areas, but also they support the food bowls of Asia, which feed at least 1/3 of the world's population. And as Freda pointed out, is very important in terms of what happens in the Himalayas affects across the borders, not just in Asia, but from Freda's presentation, it was quite clear that these effects can be felt even outside the region, elsewhere in the globe, such as in Africa, in Senegal, and other countries. Also linking to one of the questions which came up, what does transboundary risk have to do with inclusive resilience? I mean, if you can see these links, climate change impacts in the Himalayas, affecting water flow, affecting food productivity, this can then affect very severely the poor, the marginalized, and other disadvantaged peoples, not only within the HKH region, but also within the river basins and elsewhere as well. That's the link in terms of inclusiveness and transboundary risks. All right, moving on to the recommendations. The first that we have, and which is quite clear, it's been voted also the most, is a message to be taken to COP26 and beyond. Present scientific understanding is inadequate to understand and address transboundary risks. There is therefore a need to improve our understanding of transboundary risks at regional levels. Following this, the next message is we need to recognize that HinduKush Himalayan region is a climate hotspot, and that climate impacts in the HKH could have serious transboundary risks for countries downstream. The next, recognize that transboundary risks are real and could compromise national adaptation plans and nationally determined commitments. We need to strengthen regional cooperation to address transboundary risks and deliver climate action at scale and with speed. These are the three main key messages that we have, which has been voted as well. And though not in this order, but these are the three primary key messages that you have also supported as the audience and participants in this session. I think in addition to that, and we have, the panelists have alluded to these things, we also need to keep in consideration that there's a need for a mechanism under the UNFCCC umbrella, which can regularly inform parties and negotiators on transboundary risks and what are the effective and immediate action that needs to be taken. This is one message that we need to also bring in, and this is something that Babu talked about, putting in the guidelines, right? So when we talk about transboundary risk, we have to recognize that while NDCs and NAPs are country-centered documents and efforts, all transboundary risks would require a regional mechanism under UNFCCC with adequate climate financing to help nations address this risk. And finally, we want the UNFCCC to introduce mechanisms for the nations to commit to actions that address potential transboundary risks. And of course, financial investments need to be generated for addressing this transboundary risks. Thank you very much. Prabhakaran, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Drupadji, for identifying appropriate points that we should take to COP26. We really hope that the members who are going to assemble at COP26, they heed to these important messages and they respond to them appropriately. Now, in closing, what have we learned in today's session? We have learned that transboundary risks are real. They are not something like science fiction that is made up by some activists. They are already happening and we need to do something about in urgency. And we are also seeing that these impacts are being felt everywhere, and climate change impacts at one place are not going to be stay there, and they are going to be your own impacts. Now the science has done something, it has provided us some evidence of transboundaries, but we don't need to wait for the science to provide us concrete understanding. We don't need the risk assessments to be very fancy. For example, if your country is importing food from several countries, what you could do is you could list all the countries from where your country is importing food and see where these countries stand in terms of the climate risk index, in terms of the adaptation index. And you can understand to a large extent whether your dependency on these imports is at risk or not. So that is where it brings to the point of need for a regional collaboration. The session has identified that we need a regional cooperation. Probably we can think about HKH regional adaptation plan. Maybe we also need to have adaptation funding that can support more regional actions rather than just sticking to the national adaptation interventions. So these all are very important messages that we have learned today. So with this, I close this session with the thanks, big thanks to all the panel members and all the attendees for staying until end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the next technical session beginning at 2 p.m. Bangkok time, focusing on communities and local and economic sector resiliences. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hub below. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN 2020. Thank you once again for your participation and see you in the next sessions.